Almost there. Okay.
Hey, Rabbi, go ahead.
That puts everything up and ready. So we can get down to work. I'm just going to apologize right off the bat. For some reason, Safari and my browser are not cooperating this evening. And when I close the donation box, it erases the entire page. So don't know what that's about. That's a new problem I haven't come across before. Of course, if you don't donate to Safari, please let me go ahead and encourage you to do so. It is a great site, as you can tell by my frequent use. I do support it myself, although I like to be in incognito mode when doing my class so that there aren't any other distractions on the page. But with that apology aside, and we'll just have to put up with the bar at the top of the page, let's get down to work with Chapter 8 from Chullin. So Chapter 8 is going to primarily focus on the question of meat and milk, basar v'chalav. Excuse me. As Rabbi Kolp's introduction points out for us, this prohibition on the mixing of meat and milk is mentioned 3 different times in the Torah. And although it uses the phrase to not boil or seethe a kid in the mother's milk, it is understood to refer to any type of meat in any type of milk, although more on that in a second. And not only from a biological child and mother of that animal family. That triple prohibition in the Torah is used to refer to not only prohibiting the eating of it, but also to prohibit us from cooking it, even if we're not going to eat it, and to prohibit us from benefiting from it, even if we didn't cook it and we're not eating it. This is a very strict level of prohibition. And as we'll see from Chapter 8, the general outline may be quite clear. Don't eat, don't cook, don't benefit. But the specifics can be a little, confusing, which is why the Mishnah will help us understand it in more detail. So with that as our introduction, let's go ahead and get down to work on the first section of Chapter 8. Every kind of flesh is forbidden to be cooked in milk, except for the flesh of fish and of locusts. Now, again, Rabbi Kolp helps us understand that there are different categories of animal and thus meat, and the rabbis understand the categories to basically be 4 different segments. There are what we would call domesticated animals, sheep, goats, and cows. There are wild animals, such as deer or giraffe for that matter. And there are birds, and there are fish, and there are locusts. Now, all 4 of these categories in this discussion are about the kosher variety of all of these animals. And the Mishnah is letting us know that we do not mix the meat of any animal with milk unless it is the meat of fish and locusts. Now, this is a very interesting way of explaining it, because I have often had to correct people that if we want to speak technically, then technically fish do have meat, and technically locusts have meat, and indeed the Mishnah agrees that they have meat. But it is not meat technically when it comes to the question of mixing meat and milk. That is to say, when we say the word basar, we can either mean only those things which are prohibited when they are mixed with milk, or we can mean any of the muscle mass that comes from any animal. And this Mishnah is basically using the muscle mass definition to help us understand the mixing definition. The muscle mass of any animal, except for that of a fish or that of locusts, is prohibited if it is cooked together with milk. Everyone on the page there? Good. So if you hear someone say, fish isn't meat, that's technically true when it comes to the mixing of meat with milk. but it is not technically true when it comes to identifying what we would call the flesh of the animal of a fish. We can say it is not meat when it comes for mixtures. It is meat if we're just doing biology. Good? Good. Now, we scroll down to the second line, third paragraph by this translation. And it is also forbidden to place it upon the table with cheese, except for the flesh of fish and locusts. So as a precaution, and we're going to come back and talk about precautions a lot tonight, I'm sure, we would not take a nice steak together with a nice piece of cheese and put them on the same table, even though we would not have eaten them yet. That even putting the two on the table together would be a problem. Now, this gets explained in more detail through the Talmud, that we're talking here about a case where you might be likely to eat from it. Later on in the Mishnah tonight, we'll talk about when you're eating with somebody that you're not accustomed to taking their food, and why it wouldn't be a problem in that case. But in this issue of putting them on the table together, we are going to start off with a more categorical statement, which, like I said, the Talmud will help us walk back a little bit more, only in an actual eating environment. But this is meant to prevent any mixture at that point of eating at the table. Now, paragraph 4, fowl, meaning the meat of a bird, may be placed upon the table together with cheese, but may not be eaten with it, the words of Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel say it may neither be placed upon the table together with cheese, nor eaten with it. They, of course, agree that we don't eat fowl together with dairy. Rabbi Yossi said, this is one of the leniencies of Beit Shammai and the stringencies of Beit Hillel. There are only a few places in the entire body of literature, rabbinic literature, where Beit Shammai takes what would be normally considered a more lenient position. And this is one of them. Now, the issue here would be, if the prohibition on eating fowl together with the cheese is a biblical prohibition, then the removal of the two on the same table would be a precaution that is guarding that biblical prohibition. If the prohibition is rabbinic, of separating and not eating fowl together with dairy, then keeping them off the table together would be a precaution on top of a precaution. And generally, the rabbis do not hold on having precautions about precautions. And that is a general principle of rabbinic Judaism, one that many people often overlook as they spiral into greater and greater stringencies. But as a general rule, if you already have taken one rabbinic precaution, you don't need to layer another layer of precaution on top of that. And that seems to be much of the underlying question of why there would be a disagreement between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel about having these two on the table. Before we continue, Aaron, I see you have a question.
Rabbi, it's my understanding that Hillel and Shammai agreed on the vast majority of stuff.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. My micro or my speakers weren't working there for a second, but they're working now. Go ahead.
Rabbi, it's my understanding that Hillel and Shammai actually agreed on the vast majority of stuff. And when they talk about Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai, they're not saying Hillel and Shammai. There's only a few places where Shammai himself was more lenient than Hillel. They're meaning his school, right?
That's right. That's the term Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai should not be used to, that's not the interchangeable with the actual teachers, Shammai and Hillel. That Shammai and Hillel themselves, as you mentioned, did not disagree about very much. We don't find too many arguments between Shammai and Hillel in rabbinic literature. But their students, their disciples, if you will, the academies that grew up around their traditions, they did. And there's a number of interesting explanations for why that happened. The best explanation that I have found is that the students simply didn't hear the words of their teachers with sufficient clarity. They were not the ideal students. And because they grouped together in their academies, they looked for places of disagreement which expanded controversies that didn't exist between Hillel and Shammai themselves. This was partisan politics, if you would like to call it that it became, well, my teacher said it this way, and the other person would say, well, my teacher said it this way. And rather than agreeing that they probably meant the same thing, but were in different formulations, they decided that their teachers must actually have been arguing. And this led to the many different disagreements between the two schools. But yes, we should always remember Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are after Hillel and Shammai have died, not during their lifetime. Okay, onward to the fifth part. Concerning what table did they speak? Concerning the table upon which one eats. But on the table whereon the food is set out, one may place the one beside the other and not be concerned. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to anybody who keeps a modern kosher kitchen, because in a modern kosher kitchen, I'm not going to put out my hamburger on the preparation counter along with the Parmesan cheese. Because, well, no, I'm worried that there would be a mixture and an accident, and I'm just going to keep them apart. And you should, by the way, keep them apart. However, the rabbis are not just trying to teach us good kitchen etiquette and good kitchen guidelines. They're trying to actually teach us the halakha, the law itself. At what point have you transgressed? And so at the preparation area, as long as you are, of course, not mixing them, there's nothing wrong with them just both being set there. That's fine. The reason why it is more problematic at the table, meaning where you're eating, is because at that point, you are much more likely to consume one with the other inadvertently, accidentally. That you are more likely to grab from the food on the table, which is the custom, because that's what you do. If the food is on the table while you're eating, you can be in the middle of conversation, reach over and grab, and it just slips your mind because you always eat from the food that's laid out. And that's why it is prohibited to have them on the same table where you are eating from, as opposed to where you are preparing from. Now, in the modern world, there have been many leniencies around this. And if you are at a table where it is clear which food is yours and which food belongs to someone else, if you are at a table where it is clear that part of the table is a preparation zone and part of it is a food zone, then, or if there are barriers between you and the food that is the opposite of the one you're eating, then most authorities will allow a person to eat. The idea here is that you should not set yourself up for failure without taking proper precautions to avoid the actual consumption, which is the actual prohibition. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, a couple of years ago, did something along this category come up with a dishwasher? And I forget, could you put milk plates and meat plates in a dishwasher together?
So welcome to the controversy of the modern world. With a dishwasher, we have a big question of whether or not you can have meat and dairy plates being washed at the same time. Now, there are some authorities, such as Avadia Yosef, who is one of the very famous Sephardic Orthodox rabbis in the modern state of Israel, who has passed away. And in his opinion, yes, he believed that there was no problem with having both plates in the dishwasher at the same time. Most Ashkenazic authorities believe that this would be an issue of washing or of cooking them. English, end of the day, sometimes it's hard. That this would be an example of cooking them because of the hot temperatures that happen inside the kitchen, inside the dishwasher. So there are multiple opinions on that particular topic, and you should speak to your rabbi if you need specific guidance. Sometimes that also will depend upon the nature of how the dishwasher is constructed, and because some of them are more or less likely to cause certain temperature to reach certain temperatures, or to cause certain mixtures, because some people will say you can use it for both, but not simultaneously, but only sequentially. But again, some will draw stringencies depending upon food traps and how the water is evacuated from it. So it gets a little more complicated, but there is a full range of opinions within the world that cares about kashrut, from allowing them to both be in simultaneously to not allowing them to be even sequentially and having to have more than one dishwasher. There is a big range in between those, and I'd be happy to help someone if they're interested talking about their personal situation. But that does remind us of something the Mishnah has not made explicit here, because they assume that you've already memorized all the midrash and halacha, that the prohibition is only on cooking them together as well as eating. And the main issue with the dishwasher is reaching a temperature that would be considered cooking within that vessel of the dishwasher itself. And that is, again, why the food preparation on a counter would not be an alarm situation, because there is no heat being applied there, as opposed to being on the stove, or even worse, in the oven simultaneously, which is right out. So when we move on to Mishnah 2 from chapter 8, you're going to see how that issue becomes very explicit about the difference between cooking something together and allowing it to come into contact while cold. So let's take a look at Mishnah number 2. A person may wrap up meat and cheese in one cloth, provided they do not touch one another. So you are loading up your backpack, which back then would have been just a sack, and you wrap up a piece of meat and you throw it in. You wrap up a piece of cheese and you throw it in. Perfectly fine. Even if they are bare, just a piece of meat and a piece of cheese, as long as there is something between them, that is perfectly fine. Even if they do come into contact, and the Mishnah doesn't go into this in as much detail, but even if they do come into contact in this sack situation, the only remedy that is needed is to wash off the parts that came into contact. It does not consider to have imparted the meat or dairy essence one to the other if they just come into contact while cold. In the modern world, some of you may be familiar that many people are loath to even have the meat or the dairy in the same refrigerator or freezer. And many people will invest at great expense, as well as of money as well as space, into having two, one for meat and one for dairy. That is entirely unnecessary, unless you completely can't remember what is in which part of your fridge or freezer, and are constantly going to be making mistakes about pulling out a dairy product and using it with meat products. There really is no reason that they can't live side by side in a fridge and freezer. Nowadays, I think all of us, I certainly hope, are keeping our foods wrapped and isolated. So even touching and washing shouldn't be an issue. I can guarantee you that where I keep my cheese is nowhere near where I keep my meat, and both of them stay wrapped and covered in either plastic, butcher paper, Tupperware, whatever it might be, for the entirety of their journey until I begin actual preparation. And that is, in fact, the halacha, even though some people have voluntarily taken on many stringencies around that topic. Part 2, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, 2 people at an inn may eat at the same table, the one meat and the other cheese, without concern. As I hinted at earlier, if you are eating with a person that you know you're not going to eat from their food, because they're just another person at the inn, another traveler, then we don't have to worry about separating one from the other. This also does remind us that in the ancient world, or really even the classical world, a restaurant, in this case an inn, would serve dishes that were both meat and other dishes that were dairy at the same time. Nowadays, you will almost never, and I certainly have never been to one, find a restaurant that actually handles both meat and dairy simultaneously, because it's generally considered too hard for the supervision. Well, the rabbis believed in the pre-modern world, where there were actually many issues about things that we don't have to worry about, that nonetheless it was entirely possible to run a restaurant that could serve both of these products at the same time, and without concern, provided a person was just being attentive. And that is the situation that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is describing. Natan, do you have a question?
Here say that you don't supposed to, you can't sit in the same restaurant and if with someone that you don't know in the same table and eat meat and dairy. But in Israel, you can't. They separate also the tables clearly between dairy and meat, and people that want to eat dairy and people that want to eat meat. So this is the halakha today, Lemase, or this is an extreme position in Israel?
So you're touching upon a philosophical question more than a practical question. The question of, is it halakha lamase to have to separate the tables of people if the Mishnah and the Gemara say it's no problem, and all of the law codes say it's no problem? Well, it depends on whether you believe that the stringencies that have been added and invented since the 1800s are binding upon all the Jewish world, or whether you believe they are only binding upon those communities that embraced those stringencies as part of their reactionary philosophy to the Enlightenment. I personally believe that if I were a member of a Haredi community, or even some of the more moderate Orthodox communities that believe that that is the appropriate step to take, that yes, I would not want to sit at the same table. However, they are not in a position to dictate the halakha for all of the Jewish world, that those who disagree would be in violation if they disagreed. Israel is a very interesting case, because while they lack the community authority, because the community at large does not embrace those opinions by and large, and by and large, I mean something on the order of 80% do not agree with those stringencies. Even those that keep kosher do not usually agree with those stringencies. Nonetheless, the Haredim have political authority, bureaucratic authority to impose that upon any institution that wants to receive kosher supervision. Now, this is something that is changing in the current government of Israel, that is trying to open up the supervisory process to more than only the most extreme Haredi groups. And as such, we may see more communities and more restaurants following the halakha of 500 years ago, which was more lenient than the halakha of 20 years ago. But that's more of a political, philosophical discussion rather than a practical one. So if I were to supervise a restaurant and the restaurant was going to serve meat and dairy, apart from making sure that the preparation areas were very clear and everything was being done right, I would say that yes, it is perfectly fine for the restaurant to serve people at the same table with different meals, as long as it is following the guidelines that our halakha has followed for almost 2,000 years. But then, yes, you would be right in imagining that many of the Orthodox people, well, they wouldn't accept my supervision in the first place. And with the idea that people could eat at the same table in keeping with our law as it existed for 2,000 years, they would also disregard that as well. But that is part of the turf wars of Jewish law, and part of the turf wars that are so heavily focused around kashrut. As I mentioned at the very beginning of Mishnah Chullin, it is sad that kashrut, which is meant to bind and bring us together, has become so divisive. And hopefully, we'll see a turning around there. Maybe the changes in Israel will help broaden that, but we'll have to wait and see. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, just out of curiosity, how do the Haredim have so much influence when you can just cite your sources to your opinion?
Because their influence is not based upon the reasonings of their arguments. It's not that they look at a different part of the Mishnah or Gemara and say, you can't do what's described here. Instead, their authority is based upon the votes that they are able to provide to coalitions, and the demands that they make are very narrowly constructed. They ask for money for their communities, and they ask for the authority to govern kashrut and the authority to govern personal issue, marriage, divorce, adoption, those types of topics. And by being a very narrow focus, and by being willing to work with any coalition provided it gives them what they want, they have been able to have a great deal of influence over the decades of Israel's existence. It doesn't hurt that they also inherited a lot of authority thanks to the British. The way the British set up a chief rabbinate system in Israel, and then allowed that to carry over into the modern state when it was established in 1948, what's called the status quo agreement, also has lent a lot of power. But that was really inheriting a British tradition rather than inheriting a Jewish tradition. All right, more things that are probably going to surprise people that are used to modern standards of kashrut separation. Mishnah 3. If a drop of milk fell on a piece of meat and it imparted a flavor into that piece, it is forbidden. All right, so here we are talking about a situation, as is clear from the Gemara, as well as the rest of what we know about the halacha. You have a piece of cooking meat, and a drop of milk falls onto the meat. If the drop of milk is sufficiently large to cause a transformation of the flavor of the meat, then that piece of meat is forbidden. It is gone, done, you throw it away. If it would not cause a change of flavor to the meat, you can eat it. Now, this is only when it is accidental. This doesn't mean you are allowed to deliberately season your meat with milk just shy of enough to cause the transformation of flavor, which, as we know, is set at a 1/60th ratio. But it does mean if an accident happens and you know that drop is tiny compared to the piece of meat, then that piece of meat is permitted. It also means that if that piece of meat is somehow separable from the other pieces of meat, even if that piece of meat itself becomes prohibited, the rest of the pieces of meat are still permitted. The classic example would be if you were cooking in a pot and there was one piece of meat that was sticking up out of the top and the drop of milk hit it, you could remove that piece of meat and the rest of the pot would still be kosher. However, part 2, if he stirred up the pot, so the drop goes in and then you stir it up, then it is forbidden only if the drop of milk imparted a flavor into all that was in the pot. Then you are not doing a 1/60 ratio with the piece of meat that hit the drop. You are doing a 1/60 ratio with the entirety of the pot's contents, which obviously is a much larger number, more likely to reach that 60 threshold. Yes, Eric.
You get the imparting taste test, you get to try to wash it off first, right?
Well, no, not if it's under heat. If it's under heat, you would wash it off first, but you would then have to know whether it imparted a flavor. Now, I thought you were going to ask, and maybe it's because we've talked about this before, so you didn't need to. How do I know if it imparts a flavor without actually eating it? Right? I mean, how am I supposed to taste it to know if the flavor happened if I'm not allowed to taste it if the flavor happened? It's like, do I bite into it and go, whoop, I taste milk. I guess I shouldn't have done that. I guess I've broken the mitzvah of not consuming the mixture. Well, the answer to that is that you would ask a non-Jew to taste it. That was the baseline. So you'd go to your non-Jewish neighbor, you'd knock on their door, and you'd say, hey, can you taste any milk in this? And if they said no, you said, great, thanks. And you went on and ate the rest of the meal without a worry. Now, since you don't always have a non-Jewish neighbor around to taste things for you, we eventually settle on a 1/60 ratio as a way of being cautious. It's possible that 1/50, 1/30, 1/20 might also not cause a change of flavor, depending upon what you're cooking. But in order to be careful, when we didn't have a person that could taste it for us, we settled on 1 to 60 as a minuscule measure, meaning that 1 to 60 definitely couldn't cause a change of flavor, so therefore it's allowed. All right. Now we get into probably a topic that many of you have not thought about before, which is the udder. So we live in 21st century United States of America, at least I think most of the people on Zoom, and I would imagine many people on the YouTube account as well. And that means that most of us eat steak or roast or ground beef. Most of us don't eat much of the cow. That is to say, the organs, the other offcuts of the animal are usually not found in our everyday diet. You don't find a lot of people eating heart, kidney, stomach, or the udder. That bottom.
You can go to Uruguay or Argentina and you can see they eat every part of the cow.
Most parts of the world still do. It became, from what I understand, it became a bit of a status thing in America that you could eat just the red meat only and not have to eat the other parts. But although I don't have any experience except with tongue, I have heard from many people that things like the kidneys, the liver also is still in American cuisine sometimes. But I've heard that the heart, the kidneys, the other organs can be very, very tasty. And it's kind of silly that we have removed them from the menu because we're missing out. But I have to admit, I haven't gone out of my way to taste them. But if I find a kosher restaurant that offers some of those things, then I might give it a try. Okay, now the udder has a particular problem. The udder is, of course, the part at the bottom of a female cow that produces the milk for the baby cow to eat. And that means it is a piece of meat because it is the flesh of the cow. It is its tissue, and it's full of milk. So how do I cook this? What do I do with it? Well, this is what the Mishnah says. The udder, he must cut it open and empty it of its milk. If he did not cut it open, he has not transgressed the law on its account. Okay. Why? Because the milk that is inside should be emptied, but technically it's not milk yet because it didn't come out of the cow. As we've talked about in the past, when we were talking about the fetus and such, things that are still in the cow count as cow. They still count as part of the animal itself. Until it exits the cow, it's still just cow and not milk. Thus, the milk that's inside the udder, you should empty, but if you forgot to do it and cooked it, you are still allowed to eat it, even though it was cooked with what chemically is milk, because it wasn't cooked with what is halakhically milk, because it never exited the animal itself. So we should get rid of it, but if we don't, we haven't violated what the Torah said. In a similar way, or in a similar vein, I should have used as a pun, for the heart. What is the issue with the heart? Well, the heart has its blood and it has its blood, meaning that the heart is an organ itself, it's flesh, it's a muscle. And that means inside the actual walls of the heart is blood, just like inside the muscles in your arm or anything else. In fact, that's what happens with a heart attack, is the arteries that are taking the blood to the muscle of the heart get blocked. That obviously needs to be removed. But what about the blood inside the heart, meaning in the chambers of the heart? That blood isn't actually in the muscle, it's just in the pocket of the heart. It's in the container of the heart, almost like the heart's a little cup for that extra blood. What is its status? Well, as this part 4 says, the heart, he must cut it open and empty of it its blood, just like the ruling for the udder, but for the blood rather than the milk. And if he did not cut it open, he has not transgressed the law on its account. So again, obviously you have to drain the heart of the blood from its muscle tissue, which in this case would probably be done by broiling. But if you didn't do that, if you didn't cut it open before doing that, and some of the blood that was inside the pockets of the heart was still there when you ate it, technically you have not violated the Torah prohibition on the eating of blood, because that wasn't the blood of the flesh, that was just the blood that was collected inside the chamber of the heart. And then the last part of Mishnah 3, one who puts fowl onto a table with cheese has not transgressed a negative commandment. So this is continuing the discussion and argument about the relationship between dairy and poultry, and that's something that we're going to have to come back to again. So I'm not going to go into it on much more detail right now, because we will come back to the question of why are we prohibiting poultry at all. But I want to get into Mishnah 8:4. So I mentioned at the outset, yes, that the Torah prohibits the boiling of a kid in its mother's milk 3 times. And I mentioned as well that we read that to be broad, that we talked about the kid in the mother's milk only because that was a common dish in the days of the Torah, but it was representative of all of the meat in all of the milk. But exactly how far does all meat and all milk go? I get that it's not only this baby goat with its precise mother, but how big of a precaution do I take? So that's what Mishnah 4 is trying to tell us. It is forbidden to cook the meat of a clean animal in the milk of a clean animal or to derive any benefit from it. Now, clean animal here, like always, we're not talking about it's been washed. We're talking about a kosher animal. So you have a cow, you have a sheep, you have deer, you have a goat, and you have the milk from a cow, a sheep, a deer, a goat. If you mix the meat from one with the milk from another, then you have transgressed this prohibition. And if you cook it, if you eat it, or if you get benefit from it, you are out, you are in trouble, right? You have committed a transgression. But, and read the words very carefully with me, it is permitted to cook the meat of a clean animal in the milk of an unclean animal, or the meat of an unclean animal in the milk of a clean animal, and to derive benefit from it. Now, why did I say read very carefully? Because we only see 2 of the important verbs, cook and benefit, derive benefit. Eating is still prohibited, right? If you cook bacon and you put cheese on top of it, you're not violating the commandment of don't eat meat and milk together, but you are still eating bacon, and that is still prohibited. And yes, it is important to sometimes know when the commandments stack and when they don't, and this is a case where it doesn't stack. Now, why would this be important for a person to know? Well, even if I'm not going to eat what I'm cooking, perhaps my job at McDonald's requires me to put cheese on top of a hamburger. That's, the Big Mac after all. Right, 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese. I still remember the commercial that I grew up with. I can tell you what's in a Big Mac, even though I haven't eaten one in 30 years. No, longer than that now. But I can cook one. I could go down and get a part-time job at a McDonald's in my free time, and I would not be violating the prohibition on putting meat and cheese together, when I was working at a McDonald's, because the meat is not from a kosherly slaughtered animal, and the dairy is from a kosher animal, but because the meat isn't, I don't have to worry about it. And vice versa, if I were to be a person that wanted to own a McDonald's, which is perhaps a better job than working in one, if I wanted to own a McDonald's, I can get benefit from it. Even though my people are cooking and selling the milk and meat that is mixed together, I can still get benefit from it because it's not kosher meat with kosher milk. Aaron, your hands up.
Yes, Rabbi. My understanding is the reasoning for this is the Torah says, don't boil the baby in the mother's milk. How do they limit it to just food that would be kosher?
Much the way we've seen at other points in Mishnah Chullin, where if it's not something you should be eating by itself, then it doesn't really count as food. It's still prohibited, but you can't commit a food-based violation with it because it's not really food that should be going in your mouth in the first place. So the non-kosher element basically de-edibilizes. It turns it from being an edible object into an inedible object. And as such, anything you do with it is still wrong, like eating it, but it's not actually violating the commandment about the mixture, because that was only for something that deserved to be in the pot, something that deserved to be eaten in the first place. And thus, both elements have to be kosher.
So, Rabbi, then that means the purpose of these rules has nothing to do with leniency to the mother, like they think it would be cruel to boil a baby in the mother's milk. It's completely has to do with kosher then, right?
Well, yes, like I said, the prohibitions are the prohibitions. The mitzvah is the mitzvah. There are many different teachings, many of which are spiritually and emotionally very insightful about some of the character traits that we can meditate upon and use to our benefit when we are keeping the commandments of kashrut. And to go, like you said, and think about the connection between the mother and the child, between life and death, while we are maintaining a separate kitchen and maintaining separate eating practices. That's all very well and proper. But that insight cannot be used in reverse to actually uncover the law in different cases. And that's the thing we need to be on guard against. Even while it is inspiring and useful for helping us to develop good character traits, we do have to be cautious that we don't read it back into the law, but instead let the law speak for itself. And the law is that actually it's not just about our ethical treatment of animals, it's also about what did the Torah actually say. And
So,
at least according to rabbinic reading, the Torah didn't say under no circumstances can you ever take any mother with any milk. It said kosher mother, kosher milk, or rather kosher mother milk, kosher baby meat. That's what's prohibited. Everything else, don't eat it because it's not kosher, but you can still cook it and you could still derive benefit from it. Go ahead.
So Rabbi, since I'm reading the book Rationalism versus Mysticism, this would be a step back from rationalism and emphasizing the mysticism part. Since we have no rational explanation for this mitzvah, it must be something that.
Well, I mean, you could look at it that way, but just because we have not uncovered the rational prohibition doesn't mean that it isn't rational. But more to the point, I would actually argue that there's also a good case to mean that this is emphasizing the rational, that the law is what the law is, regardless of any mystical or ethical imagined explanation we might have. That regardless of what we may think about the moving of mystical powers from one realm to another, when we are maintaining this or transgressing this, the law is what the law is. And as such, we are dedicated to the Torah first, not to the additional explanations that we add on our own. Yes, Natan?
If I follow the same logic, and I say that I'm allowed also to cook and receive benefits for certain, for example, for having a barbecue and wasabi with pork food.
Yes, if you want to open up a barbecue restaurant and you want to cook and serve, pork chops or whatever, you would do, you are technically allowed to do that. Now, is it a great idea for a nice Jewish man to make his fortune out of selling non-kosher food?
Hey, Sonny does it and maintain our shalom.
Right. It is certainly allowed. And, more to the point, even if a person might feel uncomfortable being the cook in a barbecue, this does happen all the time. Case in point, if you are somebody who runs a supermarket, chances are there are many products in that supermarket that are not kosher, which you, of course, wouldn't eat, but you are more than allowed to sell to your customers. Even on another level of abstraction, if you are a stockholder in a company that runs a supermarket or Amazon, for example, then I can guarantee that Amazon sells non-kosher products, and you are benefiting from their sale by whatever stock benefit you get. And that is okay. That is allowed. We can talk about whether you want to be supporting Amazon or not another time, maybe over a beer, but that is allowed under Jewish law.
Okay.
All right, let's look at the rest of Mishnah 4. Rabbi Akiva says, wild animals and fowls are not included in the prohibition of the Torah, for it is written 3 times, you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk, to exclude wild animals, foul, and unclean animals. So Rabbi Akiva remarks that the 3 prohibitions here are not only about don't eat, don't benefit, and don't cook, but the 3 prohibitions also teach, but it is okay with wild animals, but it is okay with fowl, and it is okay with unclean animals to cook and derive benefit. Still not allowed to eat, but to do the others would be okay. Now, the idea here that Rabbi Akiva is saying is that you are not prohibited by the Torah, but you are prohibited d'Rabbanan, by the rabbinic prohibition, the rabbinic precaution that is put in place. Now, Rabbi Yossi HaGalilin is going to rebut against this, and this is going to probably bring us to the topic that everybody loves to ask about. Rabbi Yossi HaGalilin says, you shall not eat any nevela, and in the same verse it says, you shall not see the kid in its mother's milk. Therefore, anything that is prohibited because of nevela is forbidden to cook in milk. Fowl, which is prohibited because of nevela, it might also be forbidden to cook in milk. Scripture says in its mother's milk, this excludes fowl which has no mother's milk. So in the first place, he is saying that the way we know what we can and can't do is based upon the second half of the verse, which talks about nevela, and that means those other categories of animals, the wild animals and such, are also covered by the Torah level prohibition. But fowl is not prohibited because of the nevela issue, because the text actually includes the phrase in its mother's milk. It didn't just say milk, it said mother's milk, and that mother's milk is coming to say fowl, bird meat, doesn't fall into the category by the Torah directly, but is instead done according to d'Rabbanan, because mother birds don't have milk, right? No chicken ever nursed its baby chick. Ducks don't have udders. And as such, that cannot be included in the Torah level prohibition. Now, that is the general understanding of the halakha. that the Torah did not by itself, in and of itself, prohibit us from eating poultry together with milk, but the rabbis did. And he is saying that, yes, it was a rabbinic prohibition to remove the poultry from our dairy dishes, from our dairy food. Now, the general reason that's given for this is because the poultry would be easily confused by one looking, by just looking at it, with the meat that comes from the other animals, the mammals, and that would be a gateway into transgression. If not for the actual person eating and cooking, then for somebody that saw them and didn't know what they were eating and cooking and assumed that what was in their hand wasn't poultry, but was instead mammal. Now, for modern people, that probably sounds a little wrong, because most of us are used to our chicken or our turkey, which if you go to the grocery store and buy it, and the Winn-Dixie down on Fern Park has a lovely expanded kosher section, you'll see even the dark meat is still very, very white. And no one is confusing a piece of chicken breast with a bit of brisket. However, if you look at the type of food that people were eating in the ancient world, before we had gone through all the levels of animal husbandry to end up with the enormous types of birds that we have that look very different than the classic game fowl that would have been eaten by our ancestors. If you look at that game fowl, you'll understand it is much, much darker. And since most of our ancestors weren't eating brisket, but were eating bits of lamb and goat, which also is not quite as steak-like looking, it would easily be possible for a person to mistake one for the other. And so the rabbis had a very good reason for putting that prohibition in place. And really, even in the modern world, it would be very easy to make those mistakes. And so we still keep our poultry together with our mammals as being part of our meat dishes. And we keep our fish and locusts, if you can eat them, with our dairy or parve dishes. Yes, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi, just out of curiosity, in regards to updating halacha, for example, like in music, it was prohibited because people thought that people might want to fix it or create instruments. But now they're saying today, some people say it's permitted because that's no longer an issue, right? That people are no longer.
That is a correct description of the discussion on music in the conservative movement. Yes, on Shabbat. Right.
So if people are not likely to mistake fowl for meat, how come that can't be permitted the same way music is, since it's no longer an issue?
So it's a great question, and it's one that I must say I was also very interested by when I was learning to keep kosher as an older teenager. And the short answer is that when we have things like a marit ayin, the appearance of a thing, that we do generally maintain that, even if the appearance is not quite the same as it used to be. That is one of the categories of Jewish law that we don't fiddle with, that we don't look to update. However, I will say to anybody like younger me who is learning to keep kosher, or even somebody that isn't so young, but is just interested in keeping kosher, but this chicken and milk thing is a sticking point for them. And I know a lot of people that this absolutely sticks in their craw. Okay, I'm not going to say that you're keeping kosher the way that our Talmud tells us and Jewish law tells us, but I will say that you are doing better if the only thing that you are doing is mixing poultry with dairy. And if it's a difference between I'll do nothing because this part makes no sense to me, and okay, I'll do everything as long as I can mix my chicken and milk. For the time being, start where you are, keep the rest of kashrut and the separation of all of your beef or goat or lamb from dairy. Keep your chicken separate from them, and keep your your own special category of pots and pans for chicken as it's in its own in-between world, and take that as your middle ground. I am willing to wager that within a few years, you're going to put your chicken back in the category of meat, and you'll be keeping it like everyone else. This was a step that I took personally, and it does help while you are getting used to keeping kosher according to traditional Jewish law. And of course, if you are in the process of learning to keep kosher, absolutely start off with the description as we find in something like Rambam or Shulchan Aruch, or talk to me and I'll be happy to guide. Also, the conservative book, The Observant Life, is a very good guide. Don't buy the most extreme, strict version, because that will put you off kashrut if you have not already gotten used to it. I'm not saying you can't eventually be strict with yourself if you want to be. That's up to you and your own feeling of connectedness to taking on a voluntary stringency, but it's not a great starting place. So if you need that stepping stone of mixing poultry with milk, I'm not going to tell you that that's kashrut the way it's supposed to be, but that is perfectly fine as a stepping stone until you can eventually adapt to the rest. And if that takes a month or if that takes 10 years, that's between you and Adonai. But the important thing is that you are moving in the right direction.
No, yeah. The only question I had is, how do they separate what's can be updated and what can? I know you said something about appearances, but I thought that applied to music too, or no?
No, so Marit Ayin, the appearance of a thing, is an actual technical term. And it's used very sparingly within rabbinic literature. And as such, it is a technical term that has been always seen to establish a permanent prohibition, not merely a precautionary prohibition. But that's really a topic for another day. But I know that you like doing extra homework, so if you look up Marit Ayin as a Jewish technical term, I'm sure you'll find a lot on that topic. But we're going to leave Mishnah 5 for another day because we're already up to 7:58. So we will continue with chapter 8 next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Take care, everyone. And
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
The te'avon. Enjoy your dinners if you haven't already had it.
Yeah.